The evening sky was painted with shades of gold and purple as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the tall glass windows of the luxury hotel. Cars pulled up at the grand entrance, their headlights flashing as valets hurried to open doors for the arriving guests. The sound of rolling suitcases, polite greetings, and the soft notes of music from the lobby created an atmosphere of elegance and wealth. In the middle of all this, an elderly woman slowly stepped out of a sleek black car. Her movements were graceful, not hurried. And there was something about the way she carried herself that made people turn their heads. She was dressed in a classic navy blue suit, her pearl earrings shining under the lights. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and in her hands she carried a leather handbag that looked expensive but understated. Though her face showed wrinkles from years of wisdom and hard work, her eyes were sharp, alive, and full of quiet strength. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman who had lived through many experiences and come out of them stronger, wiser and more dignified. The doorman opened the door with a smile, saying, "Good evening, ma'am," as he tipped his hat. She nodded politely, thanking him softly, and walked inside. The hotel lobby was breathtaking, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, polished marble floors reflecting the light, and a grand staircase spiraling upward. Guests sat in comfortable chairs sipping drinks while business people typed away on laptops. It was the picture of luxury and success. And she walked in as though she belonged there. But what most people did not know, what no one in the lobby could have guessed, was that this woman was not just another guest. She was the CEO, the leader, and the majority owner of this very hotel chain. She had worked her entire life to build her empire, starting from humble beginnings. She had faced countless obstacles, from poverty to discrimination. Yet, she had risen above them all to create something extraordinary. This hotel, standing tall in the heart of the city, was one of her proudest achievements. She loved visiting her properties without announcing who she was, because she wanted to see how guests were treated when staff believed no one important was watching. Her steps echoed lightly on the marble as she walked toward the front desk. She noticed the sparkle of the chandelier overhead, the rich scent of fresh flowers, and the quiet hum of conversations around her. Every detail of the hotel reminded her of the hard work and vision that had brought it to life. She felt a sense of pride in her heart. To her, this was more than a building, it was a symbol of how far she had come. The front desk clerk stood straight behind the counter, tapping on his computer and occasionally glancing at guests who approached. She walked up with a warm smile, ready to book a room for the night. She had not called ahead. She wanted to experience the hotel the way an ordinary guest would. Her voice was gentle yet confident as she said, "Good evening. I'd like to book a room, please." The young clerk looked at her briefly, then let his eyes drift away. His expression was blank, almost dismissive. He didn't return her smile. Instead, he gave her a quick glance from head to toe, as if trying to size her up. He typed a few keys on the computer, but it seemed more like a performance than an actual search. She noticed his body language shift, the way his lips pressed tightly together, and the small sigh he let out. For a moment, she stood quietly, observing him. She was not a stranger to such looks. She had seen them many times in her life. The mixture of doubt, disrespect, and judgment. But she didn't let it show on her face. Her calm presence remained steady, and she simply waited, giving him space to do his job. Around her, other guests moved through the lobby, chatting and laughing, unaware of the quiet tension beginning to build at the front desk as she stood there. Memories flashed briefly in her mind of her younger days when doors had been closed in her face, when opportunities had been denied to her because of her age, her gender, or the color of her skin. She remembered the nights she had spent working late, determined to prove that she was just as capable as anyone else, if not more. Those struggles had shaped her, and they had taught her patience. And so, in this moment, she waited with grace, the hotel, her hotel. was filled with beauty and success. But she knew that a building meant nothing if the people inside it did not uphold the values she believed in: respect, fairness, and equality. As she waited for the clerk to respond, she felt a quiet determination growing inside her. She had not come here tonight only to sleep in one of the luxurious suites. She had come to see the truth, to test the heart of the place she had built. Little did the staff know, the woman standing in front of them was the very person who had made this shining establishment possible. To them, she was just another elderly guest, perhaps someone easy to dismiss. But to the world, she was a symbol of strength, resilience, and leadership. She knew that the moments ahead would reveal more than anyone expected. And so, as the soft notes of piano music drifted across the lobby and the chatter of guests filled the air, the elderly CEO stood patiently at the desk, unaware that she was about to be met with an insult so deep, it would not only test her patience, but also reveal the true character of those who worked in her own hotel. What was meant to embarrass her would soon turn into a lesson they would never forget. Asterisk. The front desk clerk finally looked up from his computer, his face stiff and expressionless. His eyes flickered with something sharp, something dismissive, as he glanced at the elderly woman waiting patiently in front of him. With a tone that lacked both warmth and courtesy, he said flatly, "We're fully booked tonight. You'll have to try somewhere else." The words hung in the air like a cold draft. There was no apology, no suggestion of alternatives, not even the basic politeness that any guest deserved. His voice carried the subtle edge of someone who had already judged her and decided she wasn't worth his time. The elderly woman, calm as ever, tilted her head slightly and gave him a small, polite smile. "Are you sure?" she asked gently. "I didn't see many people checking in just now. Perhaps you could double-check." The clerk let out a small, impatient sigh, tapping a few random keys on the computer as if to prove a point. He didn't even bother to look at the reservation system properly. "Yes, I'm sure," he said quickly, his voice clipped. Then, without waiting for her response, he turned his attention to another staff member, as if dismissing her completely. Other guests nearby had started to notice. A couple seated in the lobby turned their heads, whispering to each other. Another man waiting in line shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. The elderly woman, however, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood with quiet dignity, her hands resting gently on the handle of her bag. The clerk, feeling the weight of her silence, grew more defensive. "Look," he said, leaning forward, "we don't have anything available. It's a busy weekend. You should try one of the cheaper motels down the road. They might have something." His eyes narrowed slightly, and his tone carried an undercurrent of condescension. Those words struck the air sharply. Cheaper motels. Down the road? He hadn't suggested that to the well-dressed businessman checking in just moments before. He hadn't spoken so curtly to the young couple who had been given keys with smiles and a welcome to our hotel. But to her, an elderly black woman standing alone, he offered nothing but rejection and insult. The woman felt a familiar sting, a sting she had known throughout her life. In boardrooms, in negotiations, in public spaces where she had been underestimated or ignored. But she also felt something else, the steady fire of resilience that had carried her to the top. She breathed in slowly, refusing to let his words shake her calm. "I see," she said softly, her voice almost like a whisper, yet firm enough to cut through the noise of the lobby. "Could you call the manager for me then?" The clerk smirked, as though amused by her request. "The manager is busy," he replied sharply. "He doesn't have time for complaints like this." He stressed the word "this" as if to suggest she was being difficult, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. The elderly woman stood a little taller, her calm expression never faltering. Around them, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. Guests could feel the tension, some pretending not to notice, while others watched closely. A child tugged on his mother's sleeve, whispering, Why are they talking to her like that? The mother hushed him, but her own eyes were filled with quiet disapproval. The clerk crossed his arms, clearly expecting her to walk away in defeat. In his mind, he had dismissed her successfully, just another unwanted guest. Someone he believed didn't belong in a place as grand as this. He didn't know that with every word he spoke, every disrespectful gesture, he was digging himself deeper into regret. The woman remained still for a moment longer. Then, with grace, she adjusted her handbag on her arm and said, "Very well. If the manager is too busy, then I will wait." Her voice was steady, her tone unshaken. But there was something in her eyes, now something the clerk didn't recognize. A quiet authority that made a few people in the lobby sit up straighter. The clerk gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Suit yourself," he muttered, shaking his head. He thought he had one. He thought she was just being stubborn, clinging to a hope she would never get. What he didn't realize was that this woman, the one he had brushed aside so carelessly, was not only a guest, she was the very heart and power behind the hotel itself. As she stood there, waiting patiently, her mind returned once again to the countless challenges she had overcome in life. This moment, this insult, was not new. But what made it different was that this time, the place where she was being denied respect was her own creation, her own hotel. And that thought alone filled her with a quiet, unshakable determination. The lobby seemed to grow quieter, as though everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The clerk busied himself with his computer, pretending not to notice her anymore. But the truth was, he could feel her presence, strong and unyielding, standing right in front of him. What he didn't know was that the storm he had just stirred was about to change his life forever. The lobby, once filled with the soft hum of conversations, seemed to hold its breath as the elderly woman remained at the counter. Guests sipped their drinks more slowly, eyes drifting toward the front desk, curious to see what would happen next. The crystal chandeliers sparkled above, but their brilliance did little to lighten the shadow of tension settling in the room. The clerk shifted uncomfortably, irritated that she had not left. He cleared his throat and said louder this time, as though trying to humiliate her in front of the onlookers. "Ma'am, I told you already we are fully booked. There is no room for you here. Maybe you didn't hear me the first time." His tone carried sharpness, and his raised voice made heads turn. She stood steady, her gaze calm but unyielding. "I heard you," she answered softly. Her voice was controlled, but her dignity was unshaken. The young clerk sneered, leaning forward on the counter. "Then why are you still standing here? You're wasting my time, and I have other guests to attend to." His words rang through the lobby, drawing more attention. It was no longer just a refusal, it had turned into a spectacle. A woman seated on a sofa near the fireplace whispered to her husband, "How rude. I can't believe he's talking to her like that." The husband frowned, but looked away, unwilling to interfere. A family near the elevator watched silently, the children wide. Sensing the unfairness, even if they didn't fully understand it, the elderly woman's cheeks warmed, but not from shame. It was the sting of being belittled in public, a sting she had endured many times in her life. Yet instead of shrinking, she drew strength from it. She adjusted her posture, lifting her chin slightly higher, her presence commanding despite the insult hurled at her. At that moment, the manager stepped out from the back office, drawn by the raised voices. He was a tall man in a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression cool and impatient. He walked over, glancing briefly at the woman before turning to the clerk. "What's going on here?" The clerk, relieved to have backup, spoke quickly. "This lady insists on a room, but I told her we're completely booked. She's refusing to leave the counter." His words dripped with exaggeration, painting her as difficult, unreasonable, even troublesome. The manager sighed and looked at her with thinly veiled annoyance. He didn't greet her, didn't ask her name, didn't offer any courtesy. Instead, he crossed his arms and said in a low but sharp tone, "Ma'am, my colleague has already explained. We don't have space. Perhaps you should seek accommodation at another property." The woman took a slow breath. "I simply asked for a room. I don't see why I'm being spoken to in this way." The manager's lips curled slightly, almost into a smirk. "Because, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery, "we run a luxury hotel. Guests usually book well in advance. This is not the kind of place where one can just walk in and expect a room to be waiting." The words struck her like icy water. The insult wasn't just in his tone, it was in the message underneath. "You don't belong here." Gasps rippled through a few guests who overheard. Some looked down at their shoes, embarrassed for the woman. Others glanced at her with pity. The humiliation was no longer private. It was unfolding like a scene everyone was forced to watch. Still, she remained calm. "I see," she replied, her voice steady, though inside she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She thought of the years she had struggled to create opportunities. The endless boardroom battles, the sleepless nights spent building something she could be proud of. And now, in her very own hotel, she was being treated like a stranger who wasn't welcome. The clerk, emboldened by the manager's presence, added cruelly, honestly, "You'd be more comfortable at one of the smaller motels nearby. They're more suitable." His eyes swept over her deliberately, making it clear what he meant. The humiliation was sharp, deliberate, and undeniable. A hush fell over the lobby as people waited for her reaction. Some expected her to lash out in anger. Others thought she might quietly leave, defeated by the disdain aimed at her. But she did neither. She held her ground, her dignity intact, her silence more powerful than any argument she could have made. Her stillness unsettled the staff more than shouting ever could. Guests leaned forward in their seats, drawn to the quiet strength radiating from her. What the staff did not realize was that this very moment, the attempt to embarrass her, to push her out, was planting the seeds of their own downfall. For every word they spoke, every gesture of disrespect was being carefully noted, not only by her, but by those watching. And soon, the humiliation they tried to place upon her would circle back and rest squarely on their own shoulders as the manager turned away. Signaling the conversation was over, the woman's eyes gleamed with something unspoken. She had endured the sting of humiliation. Yes, but it would not end here. What was meant to break her spirit was only sharpening her resolve. And as she stood silently in that grand lobby, surrounded by glittering lights and whispers of guests, she knew the time was coming when these men would regret every word, every sneer, and every attempt to shame her. The manager's polished shoes clicked against the marble as he turned to leave, confident that the matter was closed. The clerk straightened his tie, a smug grin spreading across his face. He believed he had done his job, kept undesirable guests from spoiling the lobby's polished image. He didn't notice the ripple of disapproval passing quietly among some of the onlookers. The elderly woman, however, did not move. She stood as steady as a stone pillar, her calm presence radiating something the staff couldn't quite name. Slowly, she adjusted the strap of her handbag and, in a voice soft but firm, spoke again. "I asked for the manager," she said. "Not someone who dismisses guests without even hearing them out. If he cannot take a moment to do his job properly, then perhaps I should speak to the owner." Her words drifted into the air like a challenge, clear and sharp. Guests in the lobby perked up, eyes widening. The owner. Few people dared to speak of the owner in such a way, and fewer still had the courage to demand their presence. The clerk let out a short, mocking laugh, exchanging a glance with the manager who had half turned back at her words. "The owner." The clerk repeated with a smirk. "Madam, the owner is not someone who deals with complaints like yours." His tone was thick with sarcasm. dripping with the arrogance of someone who thought he understood the world better than the woman standing in front of him. The manager returned, his face stiff. "That's enough," he said to her, his voice low but filled with irritation. "The owner is far too busy to speak to walk-in guests. If you have an issue, you may leave your comments on a feedback card. Otherwise, I must insist you find lodging elsewhere." The woman did not flinch. Her silence stretched across a space, making both men uneasy, though they tried not to show it. She studied them carefully, as though weighing their every word, every gesture. Behind her, the guests whispered more openly now. A man in a business suit leaned over to his companion and muttered, "That's no way to treat anyone, let alone someone who asks so calmly." The elderly woman finally spoke, her words quiet but heavy with meaning. "You believe the owner would not wish to hear about this? Interesting. Because I happen to know the owner cares deeply about how every guest is treated, whether they booked a year in advance or walked in from the street." The clerk chuckled again, shaking his head in disbelief. "And how would you know that?" he sneered. "Do you think the owner confides in random walk-ins?" A few guests gasped softly at his audacity. Even the manager's jaw tightened, aware that his subordinate was speaking out of turn. Though he did not correct him, the elderly woman's lips curved ever so slightly. Not into a smile, but into something sharper look of quiet certainty. She reached into her handbag, her movements unhurried, graceful. The lobby seemed to grow quieter, as though everyone leaned closer to see what she would do from her bag. She pulled out a sleek leather card holder. With calm precision, she drew out a single embossed business card and placed it gently on the counter, sliding it toward the clerk. The man frowned, glancing at it with irritation. But as his eyes focused on the print, his expression faltered. His smirk dissolved, his mouth opening slightly as if words had slipped away from him. The card gleamed under the chandelier light, the bold letters spelling out her name, her title, her position, Chief Executive Officer, Majority Owner. The clerk's face turned pale. He blinked rapidly, as though his eyes were playing tricks on him. He swallowed hard, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked up the card. For the first time that evening, he was speechless. The manager stepped closer, his brow furrowing as he snatched the card from the clerk's hand. His eyes scanned the name, the title, the company seal pressed in gold. Color drained from his cheeks. His voice, which had carried arrogance only moments before, faltered. You're the woman interrupted softly, her tone even unwavering. "Yes, I am the owner. The one you insisted was too busy to deal with complaints like mine." She held his gaze steadily, her calmness more powerful than any outburst could have been. A hush spread across the lobby. Guests who had been whispering now sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the trembling staff and the composed woman standing tall before them. The humiliation the staff had tried to heap on her moments earlier now rebounded. Striking them with tenfold force, the manager stammered, I didn't realize that much is clear," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. The clerk's hands shook as he placed the card back on the counter. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by raw panic. His face flushed red, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. The elderly woman simply reached for her card again, sliding it back into her holder with calm grace. She looked around the lobby, her gaze sweeping across the wide-eyed guests. Many of them nodded slightly at her, as though silently offering their respect. Without raising her voice, without a single harsh word, she had shifted the entire room's balance. The reveal had begun with it, the slow crumbling of the arrogance that had dared to stand against her. The silence in the lobby was heavy. So heavy that even the faint notes of piano music drifting from the lounge seemed to fade into nothing. The manager still held the business card in his hand, his fingers trembling as though the polished gold lettering might burn him. The clerk's smug grin had long vanished, replaced by wide eyes and a dry mouth that refused to form words. The elderly woman stood calm, unshaken, watching them quietly as the weight of her truth settled in. Her presence filled the room not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't need to. Authority radiated from her in a way that was undeniable, unshakable, and suddenly, everyone knew it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Guests stared in awe, some exchanging whispers, others simply frozen in disbelief. The clerk finally found his voice, though it cracked under the strain. I didn't know," he stuttered. His hands fumbled as he tried to straighten his tie. His face flushed red with shame. The manager cleared his throat, forcing a thin smile that came out strained and awkward. "Madam, please forgive us. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." His voice was shaky, a desperate attempt to sound in control when it was clear he had lost all control. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, but her eyes piercing. "A misunderstanding," she repeated softly. "Is that what you call dismissing a guest without checking your system? Is that what you call mocking someone for daring to request a room? Or perhaps you mean the part where you decided the owner of this hotel was too busy for complaints like mine." Her words were sharp, but her tone remained even, steady like the voice of a teacher exposing the mistakes of her students. Each syllable struck harder than anger could. The clerk swallowed hard, his voice nearly a whisper. I didn't mean, but you did." She cut in gently, yet firmly. "You meant every word. You believed them. And you believed you could treat me as less. That belief is the problem, not the booking, not the so-called misunderstanding. The problem is the way you see people, the way you decide who deserves respect and who does not." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Guests nodded silently, some exchanging knowing looks. The truth was laid bare. Undeniable. The manager shifted uncomfortably, his voice cracking as he tried again to recover. "Madame, please allow us to correct this. I assure you, we have a suite available, the finest we can offer." But the woman only raised her hand slightly, silencing him. "This is not about a room," she said. "It never was. This is about the values. This hotel was built upon the values I demanded when I invested my heart and soul into creating it. Respect, fairness, dignity. Tell me, do you think you showed any of those tonight?" The manager's lips parted, but no words came out. His face burned crimson under the eyes of the guests who were now openly staring. The clerk looked down, his shoulders sagging, too ashamed to meet her gaze. The woman turned slightly, letting her eyes sweep the room. She met the gaze of a family seated nearby, the children wide-eyed with wonder. She looked at the businessman who had frowned earlier, now nodding slowly with respect. Her message wasn't only for the staff, was for everyone watching. Then she looked back at the clerk and manager. Her voice dropped lower, firm but calm. "You thought you could dismiss me, embarrass me, and push me away. But I am the one who decides how this place is run. I am the one who makes the rules here. And I can assure you your actions tonight do not reflect the standards of this hotel. Or of me." The power of her words settled like a stone in water, rippling through every corner of the grand lobby. The chandeliers sparkled above, but their light seemed pale compared to the brilliance of the authority now shining from her presence. The clerk stammered again. "Please, I beg you." "I didn't know you didn't care to know," she replied softly, but her voice carried across the entire lobby. And that is the difference. The guests broke into whispers once more. Some even smiled, admiring her composure. The humiliation that had been aimed at her had flipped completely, leaving the staff exposed, trembling under her unwavering calm. Finally, she reached into her bag once more, pulling out a slim leather folder. She placed it on the counter with quiet finality. Inside were documents with her name, her signature, her seal. Proof beyond any doubt that she was the majority owner and CEO. She tapped the folder lightly, her gesture deliberate. "You wanted to know how I would speak for the owner," she said softly. "Now you know." "Because I am the owner." The manager's knees seemed to buckle slightly. He opened his mouth, desperate to salvage the moment. But the weight of her authority left him powerless, and in that grand, glittering lobby, the truth stood taller than the chandeliers themselves. The elderly black woman they had tried to dismiss was the very force that had built everything around them. The authority they had tried to deny had been unveiled, and there was no hiding from it now. The air in the lobby felt different now. Moments ago, it had been thick with arrogance and condescension. Now, it was filled with shame, tension, and the uncomfortable weight of realization. The manager still clutched the leather folder in his hands, staring at the documents that bore her signature and title. His face had drained of color, and his throat bobbed as he swallowed nervously. The clerk, who had once leaned smugly against the counter, now stood stiff as a statue. His palms were damp with sweat, and his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. His eyes darted around the lobby, searching desperately for escape, but there was none. Everywhere he looked, guests' eyes were fixed on him, some with judgment, others with outright disgust. He had become the center of attention, but not in the way he had once enjoyed. The elderly woman, still composed and graceful, simply stood where she was. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her very presence, her truth revealed, was enough to make the two men tremble. Her calmness was like a mirror, forcing them to confront their own ugliness. The manager finally found his voice, though it quivered as he spoke. "Madam, I must apologize. Truly, we had no idea." His words stumbled over themselves, weak and desperate. He glanced nervously at the guests, aware that every syllable he spoke was being judged as harshly as his earlier arrogance. The woman's gaze remained steady. "You didn't care to have any idea," she replied softly. "That is the problem." Her words sliced through him sharper than a knife. The manager winced, lowering his head slightly like a schoolboy scolded by a teacher. His polished composure had evaporated. In its place stood a man who now saw his career dangling by a thread. The clerk's voice came next, shaky, almost pleading. "Please, ma'am, I didn't mean to offend you. I was just trying to do my job." Her eyes shifted toward him, calm yet piercing. "Your job is to serve with respect, to treat every person who walks through these doors with dignity. Tell me, did you do that tonight?" The clerk opened his mouth, but no sound came. His face crumpled, and he looked down at the counter, ashamed. The silence that followed was louder than any answer he could have given. Around them, the guests were no longer whispering. Some watched with narrowed eyes, arms crossed, clearly disapproving of the staff's behavior. A woman near the staircase shook her head in disbelief. An elderly couple in the corner exchanged a knowing look, as if they had seen such prejudice before, and were not surprised but were still disappointed. The weight of humiliation shifted completely now. The staff, who had tried to belittle the elderly woman, were themselves being stripped of dignity. Not by her anger, but by the truth of their own actions. The manager cleared his throat again, his voice low. "Madame, if you would allow us, we will prepare the presidential suite for you immediately. Complimentary, of course. With our deepest apologies." But she didn't move. Instead, she let the silence stretch, forcing them to feel every second of discomfort. Her calm eyes studied them, not with hatred, but with something worse for them, disappointment. Finally, she spoke. "This is not about a room. You tried to shame me in front of others. You mocked me. You assumed I did not belong here. And now, only because of a title on paper, you change your tune. That tells me this isn't respect. This is fear. The manager's face flushed with heat. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but the truth of her words locked his lips shut. The clerk's knees nearly buckled under the weight of them. The woman let her gaze sweep the room, her voice steady. The true measure of character is how you treat those you believe cannot do anything for you. Tonight, you revealed your character. And it is not what I built this hotel to represent. Gasps rippled through the lobby. The manager's shoulders sagged as if the strength had drained out of him completely. The clerk's eyes filled with tears he fought hard to hold back. Both men now stood in the center of their own downfall. Their arrogance turned into raw, public regret. The elderly woman picked up her folder and slipped it back into her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand consequences. The consequences were already hanging in the air, heavier than stone. Every guest watching knew what was coming for these men. Their jobs, their reputations, everything was now at risk. The manager finally whispered, his voice broken. "Please, give us another chance. Let us prove ourselves." But she didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past them at the guests who had witnessed everything. Many of them nodded at her, silently supporting her. Others smiled faintly, as though grateful to see justice in motion. She turned back to the two men, her expression calm but resolute. "You will regret this," she said softly, almost gently. "Not because I am cruel, but because your actions tonight will follow you. They will remind you of what happens when you choose arrogance over respect." The words sank deep into them, leaving them pale, trembling, and utterly exposed. The regret they felt was no longer about being caught. It was deeper, heavier, a shame that would echo in their minds long after the lobby lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed. And in that moment, the instant regret they carried was a punishment no room upgrade, no apology, and no excuse could ever erase. The lobby was still thick with silence. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, but their glitter only seemed to highlight the shame that now hung over the clerk and the manager. They stood frozen, stiff as statues, their pride shattered, their arrogance burned away by the weight of the truth. What had begun as mockery had turned into humiliation, and now the woman they had tried to belittle was about to deliver consequences neither of them could escape. She reached calmly into her bag once more, pulling out a sleek phone. Her hands were steady, deliberate, as if she had done this countless times before. The clerk's throat tightened as he watched. The manager shifted uncomfortably, knowing that whatever she did next would determine their fate. Her voice was calm, measured, and unhurried as she dialed. "Yes," she said softly into the phone. "This is Mrs. Williams. I'm standing in the lobby of the downtown property. 2 staff members have just refused me service, mocked me in front of guests, and treated me with open disrespect. Please inform Human Resources and prepare the necessary suspension paperwork." The words fell like a hammer. Guests who had been quietly watching exchanged glances, some nodding in approval. A businessman whispered, "She's not just teaching them a lesson, she's setting an example." The manager's face went pale, his mouth opening in shock. He raised a hand as if to protest. "Wait, please," but she held up her own hand, silencing him instantly. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, pinned him where he stood. "You had your chance," she said softly. "You were given every opportunity to correct yourself. Instead, you chose arrogance. Now, you will live with the consequences." The clerk's voice cracked. "Please, Mom, I need this job. I have a family." Her gaze softened for just a moment, but it didn't waver. "Then perhaps you should have thought of your family before you chose to treat another human being with such disdain. Respect costs nothing, but arrogance can cost everything." The manager, desperate, tried to compose himself. "Mrs. Williams, please, "I can assure you this won't happen again," she interrupted, her tone sharper now, though still calm. "You are right. It will not happen again. Because you will not be here to repeat it." The words hit harder than any shout could. The manager's shoulders slumped, his polished image crumbling in front of the very guests he had tried so hard to impress. The clerk dropped his gaze to the marble floor, unable to meet her eyes. Shame written across every line of his face. Her assistant's voice could be faintly heard from the phone. "Yes, Mrs. Williams. It will be handled immediately." She ended the call and slid the phone back into her bag with the same composure she had shown all evening. The guests, who had been silent witnesses, now felt the shift in power fully. What had started as a cruel attempt to humiliate an elderly Black woman had transformed into a moment of justice that left everyone in awe. Some guests smiled faintly, others clapped softly, a ripple of approval spreading through the grand lobby. The woman turned back to the clerk and manager, her voice now almost tender but firm. "I do not enjoy taking away livelihoods, but I cannot allow prejudice to live under the roof I built. This hotel is not just a business, it is a symbol of the values I've fought for. And if you cannot uphold those values, then you do not belong here." The clerk's lips trembled. Tears threatened to spill from his eyes. The manager's jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed the fear of a man who had just lost everything. She let the silence linger, forcing them to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then, with the same dignity she had carried since the moment she stepped out of her car, she turned away from the counter. Guests parted as she walked, their faces filled with respect. Some nodded at her, others whispered words of admiration. She had not raised her voice once, yet her authority had shaken the very foundations of the place. As she moved toward the elevator, she spoke once more, her words echoing across the lobby. "Remember this. Power is not in the titles we hold or the wealth we own. It is in how we treat others. Tonight, you chose to show your power through cruelty. I chose to show mine through justice. And that is why you stand here in shame, while I walk away in dignity." The guests erupted into quiet applause, the sound filling the space where moments ago there had been tension and mockery. The clerk covered his face with his hands. The manager lowered his head, defeated. The consequences had been delivered, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with the kind of strength that comes from a lifetime of resilience. And everyone who witnessed it would remember the lesson for years to come.